Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Emily Sandoval. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm currently the Interim Associate Vice Provost for Student Affairs at the University of Southern California. We are about to begin our last GeekED panel, State of the Galaxy. So before we begin, I'm going to ask that every panelist introduce themselves, your pronouns, and what do you do for work? And what do you geek out about? Add that.
Hello, my name is Maya Hernandez. I'm the Interim Assistant Director of Residential Education for Rachel Carson and Oaks College, and also the Crown College Programs Coordinator. I geek out about Star Wars, Buffy, and Nicole Nichols, and Eartha Kitt, and Batman, and Star Trek.
I geek out about so many of those things. Hi, everybody. My name is Alfred Day. I use he, him, and his pronouns. I am Assistant Dean of Students and Director of the Center for Support and Intervention at the University of California, Berkeley. I geek out about so many things that we'd be here forever, but I'm going to say primarily three primary geek outs are DC Comics, lifelong, Disney, lifelong, and Star Wars, lifelong. Well, 77 when my dad took me to see the movie.
Hey y'all, my name is Sai Sims. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I'm currently an incoming doctoral student at the University of Arizona, but previously I was the trans education specialist at the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's a mouthful. I would say my big geek out moments, probably one, I'm a giant Harry Potter fan. The books came out when I was 10 or 11, so I grew up with Harry, but I'm not a big fan of Gryffindors because I'm a Slytherin. It's fine. I will openly admit to that, and I can talk a little bit more about what the Hogwarts houses has kind of showed up in my work. I'm also a big webcomics fan, so I really enjoy Chaos Comics, questionable content, Discord comics. We can kind of talk a little bit more about that later.
Hi, my name is Kevin Kawakami, pronouns he, him, his. I'm resident director with UCLA Residential Life, so we do a lot of things, but in short, I get the opportunity to oversee the student experience and supervise the staff in one of our 16 residential communities. Things that I geek out about are a lot, but I'd say summary list, video games, escape rooms, board games, Disney, and horror films.
Great. So before we get started, can I see in the audience, how many educators are there out there? K-12, higher ed? Awesome. Any current students? Okay. All right, so a little bit about this panel. So this is our 9th Comic-Con that GeekED has presented on. And so 8 years ago, there was a small group of us, and 3 of the original members are here, Al and Alex Belisario in the audience and myself. And we decided to put together a program proposal to present at Comic-Con about the work we did with students as geeks, not knowing that we would ever be accepted. And 9 years later, here we are. So Al, can you give us a little brief overview of GeekED? How did we begin and where were we in 2011 to now?
It's so amazing because it began with some folks saying, hey, we should see if we can get free tickets to Comic-Con, right? Does anybody appreciate how valuable free tickets to Comic-Con are?
Yeah.
So a couple of folks sort of wrote Comic-Con and said, hey, we're educators. Do you think we could get passes to Comic-Con? And was like, cool. And those 2 folks the next year said, hey, we should maybe give back. We should put together a program proposal. Who do we know that's sort of geeky and nerdy in higher ed? And they contacted a bunch of us, and we were like, sure, yeah, that'd be great. I was going to be at Comic-Con anyway, so let's do it. We put together the panel. We presented the panel. We were over in the convention center back then. It was Friday night at 9 o'clock. It was pretty late in the program. And we filled the room. We were amazed at how many people showed up. Some folks who were in that room the next year joined us on the panel, and we did it again the next year. We talked about Geek Weeks, and we thought there was 8 or 9, and then the next week there was 80 next year, and it just blew up. And then 9 years later, we've presented every year here, and we've expanded to 4 panels here. We've presented at WonderCon, we've presented at ACPA, which is the national convention. We presented at NASPA. Brian and I are going to be presenting at the NASPA Western Regional in a couple months in Portland. We're big. I'm going to quote The Godfather. We're bigger than U.S. Steel.
And I think I was starting to call us like the GeekED collective, because as we've gone on year to year and expanded our network, there's other professionals that have been jumping along to our little collective, our little train of geeks. So what Al had mentioned, we really started with the concept of programming and event planning on our college campuses. And the theory that exists out there, and I was able to turn this into a dissertation, was that if students don't find that connection on campus and aren't involved, they're less likely to remain at that university and then eventually graduate. So this is where we came in, and the first individual, and people do geek programming. They've been doing geeky programming for a long time, but the first person who coined Geek Week in our circle was our friend Ryan McRae when he worked at Cal State San Marcos. And at the time, Alex Belisario also had hosted the Social Fiction Conference at Crown Residential College at UC Santa Cruz. So I'm going to start with Kevin. Can you tell us about UCLA's Geek Week and what it's become?
Absolutely. I think it's fun. It's really interesting because I started before my resident director role over also in the UCLA Career Center. So I got to, I think, first experience UCLA's Geek Week. First Geek Week as a participant, as an employee in another department. And just to see how much it's grown in its programming and scale and depth, right? Across the week. I think we still have those amazing wow moments that we share with students where we see folks connect early on at a board game night, and I'll run into them at the end of the year in my community and say, hey, like, how are you doing? It's so great to see you again. And they'll let me know, oh yeah, I got to meet a plethora of friends at that Geek Week event and maintain a relationship where we are having weekly game nights. And so we still have those really wonderful micro interactions and building connections between students, but I think also from my Career Center mind and now in Res Life, increasingly students are thinking about that, what is my value and my time here towards my next steps in my career, right? And so beyond creating connections between students, it's also creating those connections, I think, with employers, with community members outside of the campus setting, with vendors. So what may have been initially maybe a just typical board game night expands into, hey, we're having a board game night. We're inviting Google, Disney, Apple, those folks to also come in and play. When I think about my experience at the Career Center where I'd have to coach someone, and this is how you might want to approach an employer, and now we remove all that career fair sense, and it's, hey, we're just playing board games with employers. There's something really meaningful there, and it's more casual and comfortable for folks because they're finding themselves in their natural element.
Maya, can you give a little history of the Social Fiction Conference?
Sure.
What is it?
From a different perspective, social fiction is going in its 12th year and is the student-centered, student-originated conference in which every student at UC Santa Cruz, first-year student, comes in and takes a freshman interest course into their college. Crown's college mission. So Crown's college mission is science and technology and society and now politics. And so our students 12 years ago realized that their board games, their tabletop games, their D&D, their video game experience, actually a lot of themes, the narratives related to what they were finding in their core course of, say, gentrification and alienation and AI and what does humanity look like when technology takes over so much of our lives, that our students want to have a broader conversation. And with that said, our students were having these amazing other classroom experiences. We're taking it into the tabletop gaming experiences on Saturdays and Sundays or Tuesday nights. And when Res Life, when Student Affairs got wind of this, we're like, let's help you. Let's help you do better programming, still letting you take the lead in the voice. And our students said, okay, well, some negotiating, I'm sure, knowing our students. And right now, as it currently stands, its current evolution, it is a provost-supported, so our faculty and staff are on board, and it's coordinated from the Crown Programs Office, in which we now have faculty and students decide which students present at the conference. Students are at the core. We invite in guests. Our recent keynote speaker was Ashok Bardhan, who is an economist, most recently at UC Berkeley, to help our students think about gentrification economics in Silicon Valley, think about how many of our students want to be the next Google billionaire, gazillionaire, Amazon, takeover startup company, and help them think about those issues. Our students also are engaged in all the planning. I work with 10 volunteers from a another college, a service learning course. And so right from registration logistics to who's on the program, how the program looks, any outside festivities, whether it be a virtual reality experience that our library has at UC Santa Cruz. You can check out VR equipment and play with that, to escape room presented by some of our slug gaming crew that they create escape room experience for us. All of that is student-centered. And so social fiction really analyzes our students' current experience. What a rich time we're living in to analyze current political, cultural experiences through the lens of speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. In a nutshell, it helps bridge our students' identities together.
And a unique component of these programs and events that we tend to do, we find that when we do an event like, say, a Magic the Gathering night, students from across campus will come to one location, which is rare. For those of you that work on college campuses, sometimes our students like to stay in one area or one residence hall or dorm. But that's not necessarily the case when we go geek programming or you have a Pokemon gathering group. So talk to me, have any of you seen this phenomenon occur when there is an event that may not be as mainstream, but you get the droves of students coming out to connect?
Yeah, I can throw something in there. So my first year on campus, it was right around the time Hamilton came out, which is like, I'm a giant Hamilton fan. And our students, there's a club, I worked at the Lionel Cantu Queer Resource Center, right? So I work primarily with queer and trans undergraduate, graduate staff and faculty on our campus. And the live show for Hamilton was coming out, and queer geeks, they kind of ran into my little desk area and they're like, we want to do a screening of the Hamilton live show. And I was like, you are talking to the right person, because I have been bothering everybody in my office for the last week with this soundtrack. And they were like, yeah. And so one of the places that we ended up kind of doing and like kind of coordinating, they're like, we just need a space and a time and some snacks. And I was like, I can give you a space and snacks, figure out the time yourself. And they were like, great. And it was one of those things that I was like maybe my first month on campus, quite frankly, so I had no idea about kind of what the span and scope of our students were. And all of a sudden that night I show up and I was talking to students, and they were first year students, fifth year students, second years, and they're like, we're here to watch Hamilton. And I was like, oh, okay, like great. And it was like this really interesting thing where once everybody kind of packed into our resource center, there was a space for everybody to kind of sing along, one which was like a lovely moment, so it wasn't just me singing in the office, but there was also like great like discourse, if you will, around some of the things that our like the students were kind of experiencing in their classroom life, but also within the musical, like, oh, I'm totally having like an Aaron Burr moment. There was also a great moment when 3 of our students were like, we're doing a drag number to the Schuyler Sisters next year. It didn't happen. I'm upset about it, but that's fine. But like just like some of those conversations where students from all of the different campuses, so you had our STEM students, you had students who Havoc majors, history of arts and visual culture, I think. But like students from like different places on campus really coming together under this one particular like identity of being like Hamilton fans in this one particular space, which I think in some ways you don't always see when you're thinking about larger scale campus programs.
I would also say Pokemon Go is a big deal. If anybody needs a friend, I am looking for friends. Well, okay, I see you in back. Also, Wizards United is becoming really big. So, yes, a Ravenclaw is here looking for some more folks to join her house team too. And I'm amazed. When I came to UC Santa Cruz, and my de facto home is Crown College, and there, if anybody's familiar with Santa Cruz and UC Santa Cruz campus, it's this beautiful, basically nature reserve in some ways. But Crown College is at the highest point on this hill called Cardiac Hill. And to see students on Discord find out when the next battles happen and walk up the steep hill for basically 5 minutes to try and do this virtual reality gym battle, then walk back down and catch the bus. It's amazing to see that type of commitment. And also just the camaraderie and joy that students who are, oh, where are you from? Oh, what college are you associated with? And so I ended up getting sucked in to these games, which is great because it's a great way to build community and also get exercise and just connect with people. So.
And I can attest, I visited UC Santa Cruz before and have been a part of these raid battles where I'm interacting with students from Santa Cruz and the staff, and it's amazing. But that leads me to my next question. A lot of why we came together as GeekED was because we're able to use our geek identity to meaningfully connect with students. And I know that each of you probably can share an example of how you've been able to use your geek identity in the work that you do with students. I'm going to ask anyone to answer this.
Yeah, so for me, I mentioned that one of the things that I geek out about is escape rooms. And getting to plan trainings for many of our student leaders and staff, I utilize escape rooms. And I think the thing that's really cool about, if I think about a well-designed escape room, there are many things that connect well and relate well to training. With a well-designed escape room, you should not have to have any sort of prior knowledge or context to be able to successfully complete that. So, for example, if you're doing like a escape room around like a forbidden temple, you should not have to have a strong knowledge of Indiana Jones or any of that themed fiction to be able to successfully complete it, right? And so similarly, when it comes to trainings, what I've done is I've actually developed an escape room for our student staff in responding to emergency and crisis management, right? And the theme that's overlaid over that is kind of all of the Terminator. So our students are entering this room thinking, I'm going to go into like another 2-hour kind of presentation in which I'm, going to be watching a PowerPoint, and no surprise, what pops on the video screen is a message from our director from the future letting you know that something went horribly wrong on this day of training, and you need to complete this escape room, right, to successfully set things right? And so there's so much that can be taught in terms of, sure, there's the nitty-gritty of I can explain to a staff member what the order of operations are for responding to an incident or a crisis on the campus, but there's also a lot of things that you can communicate about your department's culture and values too through trainings. So for example, one of the puzzles involves the students successfully completing a security round of the community. And so sure, our students are looking more for the obvious things like, oh, there's broken glass, there's a fire extinguisher that's been discharged, but one of the things is they actually have to engage a student that's an actor, right, that's placed there, that looks a little distressed and is reading a book. And so upon them engaging that student, they talk to them, ask them about their day, they learn a vital puzzle piece and clue to solve the next step of the puzzle. And so even putting in those little pieces, you can really teach a lot to our students through escape rooms.
I can talk a little bit. My position is directly, I don't do a lot of large scale stuff. Most of my work is one-on-one with students because of my work largely involves students in distress, students who are experiencing out of the ordinary circumstances that are causing them to perhaps experience depression or suicidality, or students that we're worried might harm other students and things of that sort. And we've talked about this a lot today, and this has sort of been a theme of every presentation we've ever done, is my office is very specifically curated around pop culture stuff, and I have sort of rules about what I'll put in my office. I like a lot of stuff. I'm into a lot of stuff, including Hamilton, so we should talk about that a little bit. But like, my rule is, one, it has to be something I'm genuinely, authentically into, but two, it needs to represent a conversation that I can or want to have. So I want to make sure that if I've got Funko Pops, that there's a gender and sort of race presentation diversity. That if I've got comics on my bookshelf, that there's a variety of graphic novels that sort of touch on different things. Because what I found over the years of working with students in distress is a student will find the one thing in that office and they'll key on that, right? So if I remember a recent time, I have a Batman statue. Well, I've got dozens of them, but in my office I have one Batman statue. And I was talking to a student who was having some suicidality, and he looks up and he goes, "Oh, you like Batman?" I said, "Yeah, I like Batman." He goes, "Is that Silver Age Batman?" And I was like, "Oh, you know Silver Age Batman versus other Batmans, and you know this and this." 15-minute conversation just about the different ages of comics and why Silver Age Batman compared to Bronze Age Batman and things of that sort. And just led into the opening of the conversation about his thoughts of hurting himself, and sort of, and I couldn't even begin to tell you where we stopped talking about Batman and when we started talking about him hurting himself. And it's that sort of thing that just and that's just one example of dozens of conversations I've had with students because of the things that I've got up in my office.
We
talked a lot about, and I think on a smaller scale, right? For me, like as a queer and trans person, right, I don't often have a lot of like positive representations, particularly of trans folks in media. And so for me, comics were a way to find myself in varying strip form kind of piece around my own identity for myself, which was huge. And so it was really interesting. That's something that I've carried over into my work with students is like, what are the things that actually represent us? And oftentimes they're the characters that people don't often hear a whole lot about, but oftentimes are the ones that speak the most to us. And so I really, something for me as an adult that I've kind of come back to, right, as we talk about how do we navigate our emotions and how do we navigate senses of self is Steven Universe, right? And Steven Universe is, now he's 16, which is really interesting. Like, he's a teenager at this point, but before, he was surrounded by what one could call as a queer family unit. And so a lot of students I work with have problems and issues around navigating family, coming out to family, navigating relationships. How do we talk about big capital F feelings, right? And so Steven Universe in conversations is usually come up at least once or twice, if not the entire conversation. I'm a paradot, in case anyone's wondering. But there's a lot of conversations that we've had around just like, what are we feeling? Did you catch this last episode? Well, okay, what does this mean? What are we talking about? Are we talking about trauma? Are we talking about feelings? Well, how did Lapis respond to Peridot's initiations for friendship after there's all this harm that's been done, right? And so in thinking about the fact that also like the writer and creator of Steven Universe also just came out as non-binary, right? So now we've also gotten like in some ways like a community member who's writing comics about our issues and our community. And so it's kind of turned into this larger piece where I find our students are coming back like, oh yeah, like in this one episode with this one song, where we've actually been able to kind of have those moments, but also in like other things, like, are folks familiar with True Colors? Right, so we kind of came up with a way to talk about true colors using Steven Universe characters as like their like more positive attributes and their negative attributes. And so it's been a conversation where we're talking about like, God, you're being such a paradot right now. And I was like, I'm sorry, I really just need to get this done. And they're like, okay, so how do you tap into a little bit more a feeling like, I don't know, maybe a Lapis, Sai, or thinking about Ruby and Garnet and their relationship and how do you kind of navigate through supporting each other through like thick and thin problems. And so that's been something that we've been able to kind of tap out when I'm having conversations with students, particularly around how they show up with other people. And so I would say that that's not like similar in that like more one-on-one conversation-wise, like we're be able to have those conversations with each other, but also with characters who are also part of the community. And I think that's something that's really important within comics, particularly in the webcomic realm of things, is that you actually get characters who are reflective of the people who are reading.
So you bring up a good point, and that's representation. And the very first GeekED panel in 2011, like Al said, there was a large group of people, but there was some young women that came up to Alex and myself after the panel and said, "You're women." Yes. They're like, "You're geeks." Yes. And in a few short years, we've seen a lot of change even in that. But if you all are willing to share, if you have an example of a personal moment with representation, your own intersection of your identities, and either how you've helped a student or even personally what being a geek has meant to you within those identities. Al, I feel like you're thinking about something.
I'm the old head here, so I don't want to always talk first, but I've got like, this matters so much. Representation is so critical. And when you told this story, what it reminded me of is we were doing at the San Francisco Comic-Con, I think 2 years ago, we were doing a small scale version of a panel that we do sometimes called University of Wakanda, the Mascara edition, and it's about representation, that panel that we do. And we were just talking about sort of how important representation was and how it matters. And this little girl got up, she was maybe 12 years old. And we had been talking about mental health, and we had been talking about how people sort of express themselves, and this sort of helps their mental health. And this little girl talked about how she was having a hard time. She was 12. She was having a hard time. She was coming out, and she was suicidal. And she read a comic book where the person said, "You're stronger than you think you are." And that's the thing that gave her strength to go to her mom and say, "Hey, I think I'm gay, and I'm thinking of hurting myself." And her mom was there with her. And because I read that comic book, and I saw somebody that seemed like me, I did. And there was 3 of us on the panel, and we had like 10 minutes left in the panel. We were just like, yeah, that was a great story. We're gonna have to continue because we were like just devastated. And for her to just talk about what it means as a 12-year-old human being who has real life struggles and struggling with suicidality and identity, and how seeing something in a comic book, and that's my core passion, helped her live her authentic life and live, period, end of sentence. If I walk out of here tomorrow and get hit by a bus, what we've done matters. I'm sorry, I get a little...
Thanks, Al. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar vein, right? I think there's that moment when you actually see yourself, and I'm trying to think, I was like the first trans comic book character that I like openly saw identified. It's a webcomic, it's called Chaos Comics, and it's written through two different points of view of like two different relationship pairs, and so you have different couples who are writing about their relationship developments, and they're six high school students, high school students, and they kind of writing about how all of their interactions, and one of the characters' name is Tom, and it was the first time that I had ever been introduced to somebody who was trans, and Laverne Cox talks a lot about possibility models, right? You give the people not just hope, but a potential way of being a person, and not in like a giant superstar kind of way, but in like a one-to-one human interaction. And I just remember being like, I'm trying to figure out what's going on with this character because he looks like a boy, but then he's like, but there's all these pictures of like a young girl child, and my brain started, I was like, oh, why do I like this character so much? And then fast forward, and I read it all through college as it kept getting updated and all the different iterations, but it stuck with me, and I remember being like, wait a minute, at 11 o'clock in my dorm room on the phone with my best friend being like, I think I'm trans. But it was also because, and got the words to say that through these characters where they were like an actual positive representation of a trans character who was navigating life. And so for me, like sometimes when I think about like some of the students or just myself, I'm always going back to thinking about the first time I saw that and had that moment. And it's like so important enough to me that actually the character has a tattoo, a large series of tattoos, and to the point where like I actually have my own version of one of his tattoos tattooed on my body, just because I think about how important it was for me to be able to have a moment in which I saw not my whole self, right, because we can talk about that, but like at least something that looked like me in a way that I could understand myself. And so as part of like my own like birthday coming into self-present for myself, I got his tattoo on my body. Don't tell my mom. Actually, she already knows. She was really upset about it. She's like, why did you get a comic book tattoo? And I was like, because you have three nerds. Like I'm sorry. I would say both of my siblings also identify as nerds, but anyways, yeah, it was like one of those moments that I think we've been able to kind of talk about too, is how we also are like nerdy humans in our own ways as well.
I think for me, it's thinking about how often as humans we self-sabotage ourselves, and working with young people, or transfer students who have these really rich lived adult lives, but often get discounted in a traditional collegiate setting. And so some of the narratives, some of the characters, some of the personalities I look to are the ones like X-Files and the play between the women scientists and the male. I get to do what I want to do. Somehow I'm in the FBI. I'm not quite sure my credentials, but you have Gillian's character as a strong role model for a lot of my women and non-binary students. But like, look what happens. And research shows having that character visually helped increase the number of women going into STEM and STEAM fields in present day because of that experience in the late 80s, early 90s. To Yoda, I have a stuffed animal, Yoda, in my office. Has been hugged a lot, but thinking about, to your own self be true. And sometimes you need to remove the hero to recognize the villain may be yourself. And what are you projecting onto others? What are you projecting onto yourself that is keeping you from maybe venturing into a major, trying out for an internship, going and stepping foot into a tabletop game meeting because you're afraid people won't understand or look like you. And so I look to those types of experiences as well, and visual, tactile representations to help our students and help each other. I think as student affairs professionals, we have our jobs and we're not necessarily completely understood and or appreciated by our academic side colleagues. And so what I try and do and how I present myself in a college campus is recognizing the skin I show up in may be different than what people may stereotypically think about someone who looks like me or talks like me or walks like me, but trying to be authentic and putting in that critical, reflective voice there.
So every year we inevitably get a question, and I'm going to actually ask the question. So there might be people in this audience who are geeks themselves, clearly, because they're at Comic-Con, but they might want to try something at their home institution or a school that they work at, and they might face pushback. We've all been lucky where we haven't, most recently. But what advice would you give to other educators who would like to incorporate geek identity in the work that they do with students, either inside or outside of the classroom, and they get pushback?
I think having a clear purpose. What are the learning objectives? What do you hope to show by exposing your students or bringing this into your curriculum or your programming? Students are going to get what? The campus is going to get what from the experience? And there are lots of books that can support that, like the Doctor of Science Who to the Science of Star Trek. There's tons of research out there. So I think coming and be prepared with that, and also showing the joy in community that bringing geekdom can bring to your students from maybe disparaging backgrounds or, backgrounds that are very diverse in public school systems and higher education, that it's like music. Geekdom can help bring commonality across many different socially constructed lines. And yeah.
I was gonna say, like, finding ways to like lean into your geekiness, even if it's a really subtle way. I think for myself, when I ever go to even like student affairs professional conferences, I'm wearing a blazer, but I will always wear like some sort of enamel pin that's like Sailor Moon or Pokemon, and I'll get questions of like whether or not someone recognizes it and it's like, that's awesome, or someone will be like, what is that on what's that on your jacket? That gives me an opportunity to kind of open up and talk about that. It's a conversation starter, right? And I think it's so important to share the stories like those that you've heard from successes of meaningful, positive interactions or of change that have occurred because of the geekiness that you have, right? I think that can be really powerful to share with folks who can help make those decisions and shift the balance towards you being able to explore more of those geeky options for students.
Yeah, I think not everybody's going to get it. I think you have to have you got to come to game tight. You got to know your research. Ask Emily to send you her dissertation, because that's actually a really helpful document in making the case as to why this matters in a great deal in university environments. You have to be authentic and passionate about why you want to do this. There's aspects of this. It cracks me up because we're doing 4 panels here. This is the Comics Conference for Educators and Librarians. Those of us who've been organizing this have been organizing it for months. I put more work into this conference than I do into NASPA, into ACPA, any of the national conferences I do, and I get more out of it. I feel like we have more impact on the real world people. I make more professional connections. This conference is in every measure I can think of a better use of professional development funds for me than the other things I do, and I get no professional development funds to come here. I get it, because it's hard to justify on a ledger, why did you send this guy to Comic-Con? And part of me wants to go, here are the videos of the panels we're doing. And that'll tell you why it is and what we're doing. I think at its core, you've got to be authentic, and you've got to be persistent and keep saying, this is important, this matters. And the more student narratives you can include, the more times you interact with a student and the student has a positive sort of interaction because of this connection, the better your case is going to be.
Yeah, I would just echo what Kevin and Al said about like how do you show up as yourself in the office, right? And I think in some ways we all kind of navigate that dance of how do we show up as ourselves? How do our students show up as each other? How do they show up as themselves, or kind of even lean into that? And so you don't always get the luxury of some parts of your identity, but I think in some ways the geeky part one is the one that for me personally, I have the hardest turning off. And so there's this moment around like, how do we just kind of live that and through my values, and how do I think about doing my work with students? And if we need to have a dance break in the middle of the office, yeah, let's go for it, right? Is there there a conversation around, like, you know, who's better, DC versus Marvel, right? Like, I don't touch that one, but, right, like, please have that conversation, you know? So I think that there's some ways that you kind of navigate through, right, and go a little undercover, right, with what kind of, like, what we're talking about. But I also think particularly, at least in working with the students that I've worked with, it's actually a very welcome thing to be a geek, right? I've had students who are like, I'm not a geek, I don't feel like I can be part of the conversation. And it's like, well, what about it is daunting, or what don't you feel geeky enough about? And like, let's talk about feeling enough in certain ways, and like what other characters kind of pull into it, right? So I think in some ways there is this moment and fluidity to kind of use this, as the folks were saying, as an entryway into kind of what is the larger conversation that we need to have. Yeah.
And also, I love that the definition of like to geek out is just being obsessive over something. So I know that I have a colleague who doesn't like the geeky things that we're talking about, but she geeks out about travel. Yeah. So I can talk to her about travel and get her really excited just to tell me about her latest trips, wherever that be it Portugal or Italy. So we were talking about showing up as our authentic selves and the importance of that. So this is a different question, veering a little bit, but our own community as geek professionals. And I know part of my dissertation, while it focused majorly on students, I also interviewed professionals about that, because it's so important to find your community and find your fit as a professional. So what have you all done to connect with other professionals to make sure that you're fueled? Because the work we do could be draining, could be high burnout. So how do you stay well, and does your geek identity play a role in that? They're thinking I didn't tell them this ahead of time.
Oh, like I said, I just tried to, I don't want to be the first person, but it's this, right? Like we're putting together panels for Comic-Con, and I've been at Comic-Con for the last 3 days. And it's funny because it's a full circle moment, because Emily and I had a talk, and eventually Emily went to grad school years ago, and I start my doctoral program first thing tomorrow morning at like 9:30.
Yeah, clap for the man. This is going to be a lot of work.
A lot of work.
But
so if you don't see me next year, that's where I'm at. But it's this, and it's connecting with this community and the folks here, and it really re-energizes me. Even all the work that it is, it fills me up.
For me, it's finding colleagues unexpectedly. There's a colleagues in the audience, Dr. Aaron Jones of the African American Resource and Cultural Center at UC Santa Cruz. I have a love of history. My other life was a doctoral student at USC in history, and the comic Bitterroot, if any of you are familiar with that, with Image Comics, talks about a monster hunting family, black monster hunting family, who goes from the South to Harlem in the 1920s. And so part of my dissertation was looking at the Great Migration, 1920s, 30s, and 40s, chronicling my own family's history from the South to the North and to Los Angeles, California. I'm the LA, California benefactor of those decisions made decades ago, and having those wonderful, whimsical conversations of the research, the history, and the what-ifs of this supernatural all in one. And so those types of things, being okay and recognizing that there's community everywhere, and sometimes you just have to stumble around, whether you're playing Pokemon Go or Wizards United, and finding people of potentially like-mindedness. At the very least, you may make a new friend. So.
Yeah, I think there's this space around, like, what does it mean to be a geek? And, like, where are some of those interests that my friends and I have? And something that's coming up for me is I don't know if y'all are fans of Pose, but if you're not, you should be. Pose is written by Stephen Canales, who was actually a higher ed human, which I didn't know until this past ACPA. But is written about the black ballroom scene in New York City, and kind of starting in the 80s and kind of moving forward into the 90s and whatnot. And I just happened to watch this last episode of Pose in a room full of trans people. And if you haven't seen it, it's a particularly heavy episode, but I think for me, there was that moment when we looked up after watching the end of the episode where none of us had to ask each other why we were upset. We all knew it, and we all felt it, and there were certain things where it was like, and we've seen it, and it was almost being able to live the reality of some of the characters, but also recognizing it in ourselves. And oftentimes I don't I think particularly with the things that I geek out about, there have been more of those moments, more of those shared moments where I don't have to explain why I like something or why this was so impactful, but we actually understood it collectively. And I think in some ways it's also been able to translate through distance, right? So you can kind of, long distance watch a TV show or stream a video game and play together in a Twitch stream, and you're all talking and being in community and kind of having those moments. And that's been something that as things have gotten kind of stressed out for me, all of the things that I've kind of navigated through have always kind of been able to find ways where I plug back into this community of folks who are like, oh yeah, you're navigating the stress, or your gem is about to burst right now. I'm like, yes, I need to I need to bubble for a second and then I'll come back out. And if that's not the biggest introvert metaphor, I don't know what that is. But there are ways in which finding, particularly among queer geeks, right? There's something to be said that the Queer Geeks Club at UCSC had the highest number of attendance of students participating in our center, which I think is really cool. And everybody's like, I don't understand. I'm like, it's because we're everywhere. But I think there is something to be said about how do you particularly find your community, and particularly in a niche community of folks who are interested in the same particular things that you're used to that you don't often get elsewhere.
I think my favorite way of finding folks is, when I have the opportunity to grab a lunch on campus or we're walking around, it's like, oh, why don't we continue the conversation in my office? And you just see, beyond, right, the, safe space sticker or pride sticker, there's also now, oh my gosh, you have a ton of Funko Pops, you have a problem. And we can talk about that, let's talk about that, And it's really about, I think, making it safe. For folks to really feel like, yes, we're in a workspace, but this is totally fine to move into conversation about it.
So my last question for you all, which we've actually done here and there every once in a while. Who or what is your favorite geek character, and what does that character mean to you? And while they're thinking, I always have to share, Buffy the Vampire Slayer is my favorite. I'm legitimately 1 year older than the character, so you could tell I grew up with her. Is there problems with that canon? Yes. I also love talking about that, though. But what she represents in terms of her strength and as a woman, I will forever be a huge fan of Buffy. Comics, everything.
I will say, if I have to narrow it down to one character, Sailor Moon. I think for myself, right, one of the first things, when you have a more than 5-minute conversation with me, you learn queer, Japanese, geeky guy. And so for me, Sailor Moon's a lot of intersections of those, and that I think in a lot of times in Japanese culture is not at all inviting to LGBTQ folks. And so it's really interesting that there's this 90s cartoon about a magical schoolgirl that's having really positive representations of LGBTQ folks, non-binary folks, LGBTQ relationships, and that was something that was really special to me, and I think definitely impacts when I'm thinking about the vendors that we invite, the partners that we include, the artists that we invite to Geek Week, about how important it is that we have those representations of folks that you can see yourself in, right? And so I'd definitely say Sailor Moon.
I just talked about this over the break, but Superman's my guy. And for a lot of reasons, but chiefly because it's you have somebody who is the single most powerful and privileged person on the planet who decides actively to say, you know what I should do with all that power and privilege? Help others.
Yeah, and I mean, mine's Peridot. I don't know. I'm a big Steven Universe fan. I don't know why I didn't introduce myself as the Steven Universe human. But Peridot is, in essence, the entire cast is all voiced by women of color, which you don't often see. But Peridot is, when you first are introduced, is very much I'm on a mission, I have this thing that I need to do, and over the course of time and kind of living with the rest of the Crystal Gems, kind of learns to tap into herself and how does she navigate relationships, and particularly tricky relationships with other folks. And for me, I think that entire show is a really great conversation about that. But also, I'm an August baby. Peridot is the August birthstone, right? In some ways, it kind of just lines up as far as my own personality, but also there's something to say about her character arc and kind of what she's had to go through for me that speaks to so much of what I've had to navigate through in my own life. So I'm like, all right, I had to pick a second favorite, then it's Garnet, because, I mean, that afro, like, whoa.
Buffy, but I think Supernatural and the relationship between the two brothers in the show over the course of them being college age into quasi middle age, and all of the rich cast of characters. Granted, a lot of them are male, a lot of them from a Eurocentric standpoint, but the fact that the show has taken risks to really look at the gray areas between heaven and hell, good and bad. One of the brothers was in law school at Berkeley or Stanford and decides to join, this very unknown, poor profession of monster hunting. I think that's just fascinating to see that sense of freedom and the sense of family that gets developed, and the whole concept of community amongst fighting this unknown evil that you'll never get credit for. You're stealing things, like the really creative life. But I think the heart of that show, what has kept me a fan over the years, I'm so sad that I'm not in Hall H at the moment seeing it this morning, is the fact that that really great writing and the play between the two main actors of the family and having each other's back.
Thank you. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If the audience has a question, we're going to ask. There is a microphone right here if you wouldn't mind coming to the microphone or shouting loud, and I will repeat the question.
I will say, in a lot of Geek Week programming, I think for me, something I've been really thoughtful of is that notion of, right, are you geek, right? You speak to, are you geek enough? And so, how can I make aspects of programming very geek light, so that you don't have to come in knowing Dungeons and Dragons to enjoy our board game night, whether that's having tutorials or having, when you're checking in with staff, it's, what are you feeling like tonight? Are you feeling like something that's around collaboration and you want to play Pandemic? Is your interest around resource management, or is your interest around competition, right? Having folks, talk through the ways in which you can access some aspects of, in my particular case, gaming has been a really fun way for folks as an entry point into geek culture, but I'm sure other folks have some other examples.
UC Santa Cruz had its first Geek Week last year, and I was one of the co-conspirators of that. And we didn't put a label on what a geek was beyond you have a high interest or passion into something. Some of our goals and objectives were to let people explore and share their passions, hopefully develop community around diverse populations on campus, but it wasn't a geek is this. And so what we did was, it was an open call on a Google form, and we had 24 programs, ranging from cosplay to agriculture. And so letting our students define who they are and giving that self-authorship, I think really plays a big role in that success.
All right, well, thank you all, especially those that were with us for all 4 hours of GeekED. This is very exciting. So thank you so much. and we'll be up here if people have any more questions.
Sorry for making this.